Hello, welcome to History H113, History of Western Civilization 1. I am Professor Eric Sock, the instructor for this course, and this is the first lecture. This is lecture for week 1, lecture 1. Now, if you are watching this lecture, I am assuming, whether that is accurate or not is another question, but I am assuming that you've already watched the welcome video, that you have read through the syllabus, and hopefully have read the document, the introduction to the course. The document, the introduction to the course, is also the written lecture for week 1, first written lecture for week 1, as detailed on the syllabus. So this is kind of the beginning of the videoed lectures, and that is, as I've already addressed in the introduction to the course document and into the welcome video. So that being said, this is the lecture that asks, what are we doing here? Because when you take a course, you register for it, you know why you do for some reason. It often is either because it fulfills a requirement, either a general education requirement or a requirement for your major, or you're just interested in the topic. So it would be an elective. But for whatever reason you have registered for this course and you're finding yourself here, I'm glad you're here and welcome. I hope you'll get a lot out of this course. In terms of what it is we are doing here, I'm going to start with that by reading to you the final exam. Because the final exam is what this course is all about, and everything leads up to it. Now, the final exam has been posted. You can read it yourselves, and I encourage you to do so. It is designed as a semester project. Everything in the course leads to the final exam. I'll be talking more about this throughout the lectures of this course. But this is really what we're doing here, and so here we go with the final exam, which is what you're going to have to be answering and dealing with at the end of this course. So, in terms of what we're doing here, we are trying to understand how to approach this problem and this question that is given to you. Western civilization, from the emergence of civilization itself to the onset of early modern Europe, can be seen as a continuous struggle for justice, how effectively to achieve as just a state as possible as humans sought to govern themselves. That which was just was defined based on a given group, state, or culture, which then did not apply to the other, which was usually seen as the enemy. Yet Plato had argued that if there is something that can be considered justice, it is universal and must apply to all. If justice is a group specific, or if justice is group specific, can it then not be reduced to individual interpretations, whereby what justice is defined as what justice means to me? Is an individualized understanding or definition of justice not then the basis for what Thomas Hobbes in the mid-17th century considered to be the state of nature, where life was nasty, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, based on individual sovereignty? Governments, from the emergence of civilization, sought to assume sovereignty to provide for a just state for their citizens. To do so, they used myth to both legitimize their own rule and to form a group identity. What, then, was the relationship between myth and justice from the emergence of civilization to approximately 1600? How did that relationship change over time? Or did it? Is not the union of myth and justice that which provides the identity of Western civilization, whereby the relationship between myth and justice is what makes civilization itself Western? Is not Western civilization itself not simply the myth of the West? There should be a question mark if you were reading along with me, or when you do read this, there should be a question mark there rather than a period, my mistake. Then this gets to the really core. Trace the origins, development, and impact of the myth of the West, or the ideology of the West, based on the varying understandings of the relationship between myth and justice, from the rise of civilization as such to approximately 1600. And be sure to treat 1. the emergence and development of ancient civilizations, including Greece. 2, the Augustan Revolution and the so-called fall of Rome, including the rise of Christianity. 3, the emergence and development of Christendom. And 4, the emergence and development of early modern Europe. When did civilization become uniquely and distinctively Western? What made it so? Is Western civilization then simply an idea? Or how could it be defined other than as a myth? Is Western civilization perhaps too simply the myth of justice and the just state? Answer these questions based on the course material, textbook, and lectures and readings, and be sure to give specific details and examples. In other words, present as strong of an argument for your position as you can. Now, that may be overwhelming, and it is. It's an overwhelming question. There's no way anybody can answer it. There is no right answer to it. There are good answers and bad answers, and I'll be talking more about that as we go along. But that is what this course is about. That is your final task, and I hope you will make it a semester-long project that you work on throughout the semester. That is the ideal and the intent. And the rest of the course, basically all of the course, is intended to help you approach this question and deal with this question. So if you're overwhelmed right now, don't worry. This was not intended to scare you off or anything. It's simply saying that is where we're going. The question is, how are we going to get there? And that is what this course is all about. So I'm going to begin with some basic issues and problems, and I'll also be discussing the practicalities of this course later on. But what we need to do to begin to answer this question is to look at the title of this course itself, The History of Western Civilization. What is it? And here I want to problematize each of those terms that's in the title. I'll be talking more about some of those as we go along throughout the semester, but especially next lecture for this week, week 1, lecture 2. But here I just want to kind of introduce you to some of the problems and issues. And I have up here on the PowerPoint slide, if you're following along, the first point here is history, a thing of the past, question mark. Now, I'll be talking more about what is history next lecture, so week 1, lecture 2. But here I want to pose the problem and the question, really, what is history? How are we to understand it? And is it a thing of the past? Now, that is a quip that has often been stated that, oh, isn't that funny? Ha, ha, ha. History is a thing of the past. I will be arguing throughout this course that history, no, is a thing of the present. It is, let's say, perhaps the most succinct definition is history is collective memory and identity. It is who we are. If you think about it, if I say, who are you? You're going to tell me or answer that question based on your own history, your own life. There are many different definitions, or can be different definitions, of what history is. And the term history can refer to different things or signify different things. I'll be talking this as we go along. And in one way, the most general way, is history is everything that has happened in the entire world from the beginning, whatever that may be, until today. So it's an issue of time. But what is time? How do we get there? And how do we know? How do we know the past? That is a real question. I have it there, collective memory. Collective memory is simply what a society, a culture, a group together, not necessarily for each member of the society or group, but as a whole, what they remember about themselves and what happened. Based on archives, based on written accounts and libraries, collective memory is memory of the institution, the state, whatever it might be. You may have heard the term institutional knowledge, and with businesses and corporations and the problems that can arise if they lack institutional knowledge and institutional history. The same with history in general. As a country, as a state, who are we? Because our memory gives us our identity in so many ways. If you lose your memory, the question is, who are you? It's like, I don't remember. Memory and identity. Memory is so difficult. And the whole question of identity is so problematic. What is it? Is it something that is inherent within us? Is it something that we create for ourselves? What does it mean to answer the question, who am I? And how does that question change over time? So for an individual, who am I? I would answer that question, differently today than I would have 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 40 or 50 years ago, certainly. So is there a continuity in who we are? And if so, what is that continuity? Or is it always changing? And if so, what is that changing identity based on? How was it formed? What are the different forces affecting it? Those are the questions we're trying to get at. Not so much in this course as the course for yourself or myself. I'm not asking the question in the final, who are you? I think it'll be kind of fun to do that, but that's not the point of the course. But for ourselves as a culture civilization, who am I as Western civilization? If the I is Western civilization, what does that mean? Who am I and how have I developed? And how have I conceived of myself differently? Which again is simply memory writ large. That is what we're getting at. And then I have up here on the next point is the historically affected consciousness. We'll be talking more about this too next lecture. That's a term that comes from the philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer, Truth and Method. And what he means by that is really that our very consciousness is formed by history, whether we're aware of it or not. And the historically affected consciousness and historical understanding, historical consciousness, is becoming aware, increasingly aware, of the extent to which our own consciousness is historically affected. I'm not going to say determined, but historically affected and shaped and molded. We are products of history, as well as creators of history and contributors to history. And having that awareness and that ability to think historically, which is not simply, oh, I know things about the past that have come before, is to realize the problems involved with time, with identity, and with what I will be talking about more about ideology. I'll be talking more about that later. History, in the broad sense, as I've already said, is everything that's happened in the past, but in a more specific sense, history is what historians write. History is about what historians write based on the extant evidence or sources. Evidence and sources. I'll be talking a lot about this as we go through the course. So the rewriting of history, because history is always being rewritten. We think of history as it's in the past, it's knowable, it's just out there, we just have to kind of find it. That is a complete misconception, a complete misunderstanding of what it is, both as such, kind of as everything that has happened. In some ways we can say, okay, well, yes, everything that's happened has happened. But then how do we know that? And that's the question. How do we know? How do we learn? We learn about history because it's based on what we've been taught and what we then find out for ourselves. But what have we been taught is based on what historians have written. It's a real process. And that process or that discipline of looking at the history of history writing, as I'll be talking more about next lecture, is referred to as historiography. So the question is, what is the relationship between history and historiography, and how do the answers to those questions affect our understanding of what happened in quote-unquote the past? Can we even know the past? How do we go about doing so? So that's why I say history is a thing of the past, or a thing of the present, because everything we know about history, everything we study about it, we do so in the present. We can't go back to the past and observe. What we can't observe is the extant evidence that exists in the present, that signifies something that no longer exists, that did exist. We'll be talking more about that as we go along. You can say, well, oh my gosh, we're talking about existence and time and being. What does that have to do with Western civilization? And I would say everything. Just like the question of who am I has everything to do with the question of what is Western civilization. Because how we have answered that question. We collectively as human beings have answered that question over time, implicitly or explicitly. It's what forms Western civilization, or what did form Western civilization, has formed it. It's not that people of the past always sat around and said, who am I? Oh my gosh, I'm having an identity crisis. Who am I? No, they're just acting, living people. But that is all based on this understanding, again, implicitly, if not explicitly, of who am I? What is my identity? How does that work itself out in terms of what do I do in my relationships with other people? And therefore, both in terms of identity and in terms of the historiography, history is a creation. We are creating ourselves. We are creating our past, which does not mean it's a fiction. History is not the same as historical fiction, because history as a discipline, history writing, is based on the evidence, and therefore it is, to that extent, scientific. We study artifacts that exist, texts, ruins, anything that exists today in the present that signifies the past forms part of the evidence for historians. Now, that is a lot to take in and to think about. I hope we'll see how that plays itself out as we go along. And I'll be talking more about what is history, that first part of the term, in the next lecture. But here then I want to switch to the other term of the course. What is Western? This is a history of Western civilization. We have the problem of what is history, but we also then now have the problem of what is Western. And I hope you begin to see the problem in the whole course, the conception of it. Because if history is a problem, so is this idea of Western. And what is Western? Is Western a geographical designation, or is it a concept? Now, if we look on the PowerPoint slides, after the slide, what is Western, we have then a map that I've posted there, White Fleet's map of the world in 1598, just about when this course ends. So when this course ends, here is a map, a representation of the world. And you can see there up on top the title, Utriusque Hemispheri Delineatio, which is the delineation of the two hemispheres, Eastern and Western. And as you're looking at it, the Eastern Hemisphere is on your right and the Western Hemisphere is on your left. On the right, you will see, I think you can still make it out, Africa, Europe, and Asia. And that's all part of the East in their conception in 1598. The West, you can sort of make out as North America and South America. You know, they have New Guinea down there, Nova Guinea as Australia. But what is that division based on? It's really the quote-unquote old world, or the Eastern world, or hemisphere of the world, and then the Western, which in 1598, the Western Hemisphere, what they referred to as the Western Hemisphere, was still relatively new. They talked about it as the New World. And it wasn't new to the indigenous inhabitants, but to Europeans, it was new. I'll be talking more about that as we go along. But the point here is there's no absolute position of what is Western. Western is based on a point of observation, because wherever you are, there is north, south, east, and west. So if I'm in Japan, what is west of me is Asia and Europe. And what is east of me is the United States. It all depends on your point of observation, which is true for all of history. So when we talk about this concept of Western civilization, the content of it, what is Western? We're talking about the understanding of what we observe from a particular point of observation. Therefore, is it not then not geography, but ideology? Now, ideology is a term that I use a lot. Um, I think it's an important term. Today, it has so often negative connotations. No, I'm not an ideologue. I don't have ideology. I have political theory. I have philosophy. I don't have ideology. Ideology is skewed understandings. That understanding of the term ideology stems from actually Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who wrote a book, The Development of Ideology or Origins of Ideology or something like that. Or the German ideology. That's what it was. I'm sorry. The German ideology. But originally, the term ideology, as it was first used in the later 18th century by a French scholar, Destutt de Tracy, simply meant the history of ideas. Ideology is the study of ideas, ideology, the knowledge of ideas. That led to the development of intellectual history, history of ideas. That's not how I use the term. In Latin, the term intellectus is not really intellectual as we think of it in terms of intellectual history. It really means understanding. Intellectus is in Latin is understanding. So for me, yes, I do intellectual history, but for me that means the history of understanding. How do we understand the world that we're in? How do we understand ourselves? And that is what we're looking at then is the structures of meaning. Ideology, I define it for this course, are the structures that allow us to make sense of the world. How do we ascribe meaning to ourselves and to our world? And what are the forces and structures that condition our doing so? That is ideology. We all have an ideology, whether we're aware of it or not. Some are very similar, some are very different. And we can look at then, let's say, groups of ideology, whereby this group, all these people who have share, to an extent, a large extent, a particular ideology, have a different ideology from other groups that have different views and opinions and things. They put the world together differently. That is what ideology is all about. That is what intellectual history, as I use the term, is all about. The history of understanding who we are, where we've come from, and where we're going. So ideology for me is not a negative term. It is simply looking at how we construct our own understandings of ourselves.